Welcome on Texas Football. I'm Bobby Burton, your host, joined by Gerry Hamilton and CJ Vogel. It's time for some practice, but also time for this week's State of the Program, brought to you by our friend Adam Lowy, the Lowy Law Firm. CJ and Gerry, I got to tell you guys, we've been waiting for this for what? Since April 20th, the day of the spring game. Is that right? April 30th. I can't even remember what date it was now. It's been so long ago. But July 31st, just 2 hours away, 2.5 hours away, we're going to be watching practice, all out there in full regalia, trying to find out what's going on with the Longhorns. It is literally right around the corner. On Tuesday, the coaches, or actually the coordinators for the Longhorns, stepped to the podium, spoke to Texas media. Not only did Kyle Flood, the offensive coordinator, come and talk, but also Pete Kwiatkowski, as well as Jeff Banks. And they, each of them delivered their own kind of treatise on what's going on. Gerry, I'm going to start with you and ask you a little bit about what Kyle Flood talked about from an offensive line perspective. He mentioned that he thought he had as many as 8 right now that were ready to go. And it was interesting. He's just continued to be very, very high on this offensive line.
Yeah, he loves his guards. And he kind of but Texas kind of has an issue at guard because they have multiple players who are starter levels. And that's a good thing and a bad thing, right? I mean, Cole Hudson started 13 games as a freshman, and unless there's an injury, he's not slated to start this year. And then you have Neto, who came on and had a really good spring. That was the first time, I think, the end of the 23 season practices, especially leading up to the bowl game, were the best he's had at Texas. Then he had a solid spring, even spent some time as the starting left guard when Hayden Connor was working at center. I think it's a good problem to have, but it's still a problem. But I do think this is why you're going to see Kyle Flood actually play more of a rotation at guard this year. And that could be 4 guys. That could be Hayden Connor, Neto, DJ Campbell, Cole Hudson. It's a longer season, even though you have 2 off weeks, or Texas is planning on having a longer season. But I do think they're at the point where now, and that's the best news for Texas, they've built up the depth to where he thinks he has 4 starting caliber guards right now. When he got to Texas, he had 1.5, 2. I mean, so it's a big change. And I think that's confidence. Also, he mentioned Malik Ogbo today, who Malik Ogbo trimmed down, his backup, I think, closing in on 300 pounds. But will be obviously a big part of that jumbo package. But also remember this, I mean, he's an injury away from being in that guard rotation too, essentially. And he may have the quickest feet of any lineman on the Texas team.
I tell you what, I got to be honest, Gerry. Kyle Flood even mentioned him as a possible tackle. Yeah. He's lost so much weight, right, from when he started. And he's already playing on the outside, so he's as a tight end, as that jumbo tight end. So maybe that equates a little bit, because when Kyle Flood started talking about backups at tackle to both Cam Williams and Kelvin Banks, he mentioned Malik Ogbo right there along Trevor Gooseby, Brandon Baker, Jaden Chapman. Yep. All of those. Andre Kojo even mentioned. So I think that's interesting. I was going to ask you, CJ, about the center position, because, look, Gerry and I are on the same level, and I think you are too, CJ. We love Daniel Cruz as a recruit. Absolutely loved him, okay? At the same time, it's clear Kyle Flood's not going to go into this season thinking a true freshman has to be his backup center. And he went with Connor Robertson and really sang his praises, and talked about a couple other guys that are going to be working there as well.
Yeah, this kind of been a staple of Kyle Flood's, offensive line at Texas, sans that first year, right? Now that he's got that depth working, there's going to be multiple guys working in at center to make sure that depth is built up. We saw it last year as Connor Robertson filling in for an injured Jake Majors. Obviously, Cole Hudson was injured as well. Otherwise, you would have seen perhaps Hudson move to left guard and Hayden Connor move to the interior, or vice versa, right? Both of those guys had received snaps in the spring and in fall camp leading up to the start of the season to, essentially be familiar and comfortable at the center position, because we've talked about it. That spot is so important. we've seen when centers and the communication between centers and offensive linemen, the snaps between centers and quarterbacks are off. It throws off the entire rhythm of an offense. It delays and hinders, all sorts of possibilities in terms of what your ceiling can be offensively. To have multiple guys in a position to come in and step in and be plus guys at the position, very important. And now you're seeing Texas in a position to have not just one or two with Connor Robertson, but 3, 4, and potentially even 5 when you come into, Cole Hudson, Hayden Connor, Daniel Cruz down the road. It's very important. It's very crucial. And Texas finally has that built-up depth that you're talking about at the center spot right now.
Bobby, I want to piggyback off that one thing, because Daniel Cruz is headed for a redshirt because Texas can afford to redshirt him. And that's a great thing for him because he played his senior high school at center position, and still some at tackle when needed. But that was his first experience at center. But one thing, the other thing is there's 3 freshmen in this class. And obviously Nate Kibble, a redshirt, he wasn't there for the spring. But something I think we should point out on Brandon Baker right now, and this is what I was circling back to. Jaden Chapman's been in the program. Now this will be year 2. And I'm not saying he's the only competition behind Cam Williams, but if Brandon Baker wins the backup right tackle job, when you have a Malik Ogbo, when you have a Jaden Chapman, and when you have other options there, Andre Kojo, if Brandon Baker wins the second team right tackle job, Texas fans should be very excited about his future, because it would be easy to just sit him back and redshirt him. But if he comes in and beats those guys out and Flood puts him at the second team right tackle, that would say a lot for his future.
Hey, Flood is not scared of doing that.
Nope.
In my opinion, not scared of it. He did it with Kelvin Banks right out of the gate. Hey, before we go further, and I want to talk a little bit about the offense as a whole, as well as the defense and special teams, I want to say thank you to our sponsor of the State of the Program. Each and every State of the Program brought to you by our friend Adam Lowy at the Lowy Law Firm. If you've been injured in a car wreck, truck wreck, automobile accident of any kind, and you want someone with experience representing folks from the state of Texas, give Adam and his team a chance and give them a call. LowyLawFirm.com. They'll give you a free consultation before that. All right. Hey, I asked Kyle Flood on Tuesday, asked him point blank, what are your goals for the offense? He said, same as always, to be the most explosive offense in the country. But then he went in and said this, which I thought was really, you can talk about high emotional quotient or high IQ type of answer. He came back and said this, the best offenses, the elite offenses, are also elite situationally.
Yes.
They're not just good and blowing people out, scoring 45 points a game. They're also good on 3rd and 2 when you got to have it in the 4th quarter. Or in the red zone, which was what one of the original questions was about as well. And so he goes, look, you're not just elite if you can just score a bunch of points and explosive. You got to be elite in elite situations. What do you two think about that?
I think he's 100% right. And if there's a couple of things you kind of look at with Sarkisian, is we talk about the stats have been out there now. Pass the set up the run at the beginning of a game, right? But to Flood's point, I think there's 2 things. Being able to run the ball on command when you need to, whether that be a 3rd and 2 in the 3rd quarter, 2nd quarter, whatever. Being able to sustain a drive to win a game, control the late with the run game, which Texas did against Bama last year, right? Then the other one is run the ball in the red zone when everybody knows you're trying to run the football. And that may be the biggest one for Texas left, that biggest hurdle left. Because we talk about the red zone and we talk about Quinn Ewers and the receivers and Steve Sarkisian play calls in the red zone. That's probably talked about other than defensive line. That's what's been talked about the most in the offseason. But here's the key. If you can run the ball when people know you're going to run the ball, boy, does it make your red zone play calls easier from a passing perspective. So that's going to be a big step, this offensive line. If they're going to be a top 1, 2, or 3 offensive line in the country, which I think Georgia's 1, so 2 or 3, that's going to be a big part of it. When you get inside the 20, can you run the ball when you want to, when they know you're going to run the football? That's a key for this Texas team this year.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback off of that as well, Gerry. I mean, you look at obviously the Alabama game, you run off 7 minutes in which that's the objective. You're going to sit there, you're going to run some clock, and you're going to limit what the opportunities for Alabama when you have a 10-point lead. That's the name of the game. That's how you win important football games on the road. I looked at 2021 as kind of the first staple and kind of, point proven by Kyle Flood. And there weren't many positives out of that first season. But when you go on the road to Fort Worth, a place where you haven't had much success, and you have a 5-point lead, and you're able to run off the last 4.5 minutes, not 7, but 4.5, with that offensive line, who not as talented as it is today, but you don't allow TCU to have an opportunity to go down the field and win the football game at home. That's the sign in which Texas fans, I think, looked at and said, okay, this guy's got it figured out, right? He understands how to build an offensive line.
To your point, the very next year we saw them do it to Baylor late in the year. Didn't even throw a pass basically in the second half and did the same thing. I definitely think we all agree that Kyle Flood's got a little something to him on the offensive line, and that should be the unit that leads the way. I want to step forward a little bit here and go on over to defense. Pete Kwiatkowski on Tuesday said some interesting things, in my opinion. One of them, he talked about incremental improvement across a number of different phases of the game. He said this, CJ and Gerry. He talked about being 33rd in the country in pass defense efficiency last year. He said that Texas was thrown against the third most amount of any team in the country because they were so good against the run, right? So a lot of what we talked about is true in this offseason. Some of that was a byproduct of just how good they were against the run. The teams that they were playing felt like they had to pass to move the football. One of the things that he came up with and talked about, because look, we're a pretty good tackling team. They ranked like 80%, he said. We want to try to get up to 85. Okay. And he goes, the reason that I say that is a lot of those a lot of those tackles and run after catch yardage guys was after a catch. So a lot of it wasn't necessarily the completed passes that bothered Steve Sarkisian and Pete Kwiatkowski this last year. It was actually the big run by Amari Niblack
in the Texas game.
Yeah, against Alabama. Yeah, and so those are the kinds of ones that he worried about. Some of them happened against. Here's a team that you just mentioned, CJ. Savion Williams at TCU. A lot of run after catch yardage. He said that's one of the things they need to minimize this year. Do y'all agree with that whole context of what he's saying right there? CJ, I see you nodding your head. You'll go first.
Yeah, we've mentioned a few games there in which the yards after catch really stood out. The one to me was Houston, right? Those death by a million underneath routes and slants basically in that second half, completely erased what was a 21-point lead for the Longhorns, and it seemingly didn't have an answer. And now you saw Texas immediately after kind of correct that, understand where to be on those underneath crossers. So if that is the solution moving forward, I agree, and this goes into what I think is a completely new looked secondary. I know there's some returning pieces in terms of Manny Muhammad, Jahdae Barron, but in terms of the athleticism and speed that you'll see across the board, it's not just running fast, it's instinctual. I think Andrew Makuba is an instinctual football player. I think Derek Williams is a very instinctual football player. To have those guys on the back end while also having, very high IQ guys like Manny Muhammad and Jahdae Barron and Jalen Gilbo, who was also singled out as a guy that's ready to take that next full-time step this year. Very encouraging to me in terms of what you will see in the pass defense. And of course, Bobby and Gerry, it certainly helps that defensive edge room is looking like they'll be certainly after the quarterback 100% more this year.
I think actually that's the bigger thing. So I give credit to offensive guys for making plays a lot because the game's played in space. A lot of people wanted to tackle Xavier Worthy. Right. Yes. Okay. I mean, a lot of people wanted to tackle Jalen Waddle at Alabama, but they couldn't. So what then becomes the most important thing? It's getting to the quarterback. It's disrupting timing. It's getting hits. To me, when I look at the Texas defense, that's the number one area, bar none, that they have to improve. Michigan had 39 sacks last year. Alabama had 39 sacks. That 39-40, if you traditionally look, the Georgia team, second national title team, was around 35. But once you're at that 39-40 up to 45 range, you're not just getting a lot of sacks. You're putting a lot of pressure on the quarterback. And if an opponent goes into the game knowing, man, these guys are going to be on us, then they have to get the ball out quicker. And your defensive backs are in a better position that they don't have to cover for 3 seconds. They know what's coming. So that makes it easier to tackle when the game is played less in space and they're getting the ball out quicker, not as much into longer developing routes where guys are running free across the field like Amari Niblack, right? The pressure is going to create a lot of those issues or improvements for Texas, in my opinion, this year.
Hey, Gerry, I think you make great points. I will say, though, PK was asked point blank on Tuesday, who's a guy that we need to be on the lookout for?
Yeah.
As the media asked this question, the response within 5 seconds, the first name out of his mouth, Jalen Gilbo.
Yeah.
CJ just mentioned his name a few minutes ago. I told y'all a couple of days ago that I felt like Jalen Gilbo could give Jahdae Barron a little sneaky run for his money at that star position this year. What do you make of that? I mean, is it because Barron's going to see some time at corner as much as anything? Is Gilbo just being that good that he's forcing some people's hand to make sure they play him?
So I think it's twofold. I think one, Jalen Gilbo's healthy now. Knock on wood, he stays healthy through August practice here. But it's so easy to forget when a guy's injured or not 100%. When Jahdae Barron went down with injury, they didn't hesitate to put Jalen Gilbo out there as a starter as a freshman. So that immediately told you how
true freshman.
That immediately told you how talented they thought he was, because he had already had a little bit of an off the field minor thing, right? So they also stuck with him through that. So they knew how talented he was. I'll say another thing for Jalen Gilbo, a little background there. His best friend's Bryce Anderson. These Golden Triangle kids are really hyper-competitive guys. Who's always ranked higher? Bryce Anderson. Who's thought about higher in the NFL draft? Bryce Anderson. I mean, so they run a camp together. They grew up together. They're best buds. Jalen Gilbo's got that positive chip on his shoulder as a football player. And he's battling back now from injury. He's back healthy. He's got something to prove. CJ, I don't know if CJ saw him play in high school, but he always played like he had something to prove from a physicality standpoint. He just had that mentality. So I think one, Gilbo is a guy who, go back to his freshman year if you want to know how good the Texas staff thought his upside was. But then I think the other thing there is with Jahdae Barron, he does have versatility. You know what? It's up to these safeties. Derek Williams in year 2, Jelani McDonald moving the safety, Michael Taff year 3, to make Texas say, you know what, Jahdae, we probably don't need you at safety. Do we need you at corner? I mean, so I think if the Jalen Gilbo's play, his spring, and where the confidence is with this staff does give to this defensive staff the ability to think about, could Jahdae Barron help us more somewhere else, and we have Gilbo on the field too.
Gary Patterson's a big DB guy. We know that. Jalen Gilbo was a Gary Patterson DB, and we forget how close he was to actually ending up at TCU. So that's one thing I always point back to in terms of the physicality and the instincts on the field. Gary Patterson knows DBs, and he was the top priority for him at the time.
Guys, I've got another thought here. All off season, I have been saying one of the keys to the defense in 2024 will be Anthony Hill becoming a true linebacker, being a natural inside linebacker. PK on Tuesday said this. He said essentially, I teased Anthony Hill a little bit. Anthony, you're a great football player. You're not yet a great linebacker. And he goes, what he meant by that, he goes, he meant it as a very big positive towards Anthony. Was like, you've got a nose for the football. You've got things I can't teach, right? But now it's getting down to the nitty gritty and learning the details of the position. I will say this, though. I've been worried that he's not a quote-unquote natural middle linebacker. Pete Kwiatkowski called him a natural middle linebacker, by the way. So keep that in mind. I want to go on to say PK also had a lot of great things to say about David Benda.
Yes.
And not just about David Benda as a player, but as a representative of the University of Texas.
Yeah.
He said, look, that guy bleeds bird orange, period, end of story. He's the kind of guy that pays attention in meeting rooms. He's never late. He's always early. He's always trying to learn. All of those things. So take that from me for a little info on Benda as well as Anthony Hill. I want to segue into this part and get y'all's take on this. When PK was asked about possible big award winners, maybe for Texas, who might they be? Anthony Hill was the first name out of his mouth. That makes sense based on his pedigree, 5-star, etc. He also mentioned Alfred Collins. He said he felt like Alfred Collins was coming on a little bit. But the other name that actually came out second, Trey Moore. Gerry, to your point, and CJ, to Jerry's point about the edge pass rush meaning so much, I get the feeling that PK knows what 14.5 sacks could mean to his defense this year.
You want to know how good Trey Moore is? They didn't play him in the spring game. That's always a good sign.
Say that again.
We want to know how good they think Trey Moore is? They didn't play him in the spring game.
You think they hit him?
He'd been dealing with a minor injury, but still, nah, They didn't want him out there running around like that.
Yeah, they
not too much.
Yeah, CJ, another guy that he mentioned as kind of the backbone or stalwart at the position is Barron Sorrell, and I feel like a broken record every time I see Barron Sorrell. He looks like a better player and a better prospect, even beyond just college football into the NFL. What did you take away from what he said about Barron Sorrell on Tuesday?
Yeah, it was very encouraging to hear Barron Sorrell's name mentioned again. We've heard a little bit about David Benda being a big vocal guy, but Barron Sorrell's been that constant, I would say, dating back to the spring, maybe that back half of that 2023 season, right? Out of the spring, when we had some player availabilities, the first name that we continue to hear about was Sorrell. I asked Arch Manning at the Manning Passing Academy, who are some of the broader leaders on this team, and Sorrell was one of the names that he mentioned as well. So this means something to him, right? He's not a Texas kid, but he's bought in completely, and this staff trusts him, obviously, being a multi-year starter, being a multi-year contributor, to come in with a lot of expectations in that edge room. He understands, obviously, what it takes to get close to a national championship, but to also kind of understand what it's like to need to have that vocal leader in a year out, year in kind of situation whenever you depart a lot of contributors from a year ago, and obviously needing that same level of intensity and focus going into a new year. He's taken on that role 100%. And again, it wouldn't surprise me. I know Texas doesn't do it often, but to see that C on the chest, he would absolutely be one of those guys this year.
I think that's a great
I was going to say, if we listed the most consistent players on the Texas team, he'd be in the top 1, 2, or 3.
Based on what I heard during that press availability on Tuesday, he would be one. I think David Benda would be one. I think Michael Taff would be one. And that's going to lead me into the talk about special teams. Because when Jeff Banks talked about special teams, he was asked, who are your special teams guys? Who are the guys you rely on? 2 names came out of his mouth: Michael Taff and Mo Blackwell. And he said both of them, neither one of them are gunners, right, guys. They're not the what do you want to call it? They're not the stars.
No, they do the dirty work.
Yeah, they're the meat and potatoes. They're not the dessert. Right. And he was just Banks was just effusive in his praise for those two. In Gerry, it's funny. You mentioned the talk about a chip on his shoulder earlier for Jalen Gilbo potentially. He felt like Michael Taff plays like he has a chip on the shoulder, but doesn't act like it to his teammates. That was the distinction he made. It was very interesting there. But overall, he talked a lot about special teams. The return game, et cetera. CJ, what are some of the things that caught your attention in that?
Yeah, of course, he mentioned Warren Roberson, and I think that was one that surprised me a little bit in terms of a gunner. I was expecting Gavin Holmes, but, you don't often see your starting frontline cornerback in the spot. So who else is going to be in that spot in the spring? We saw it with Holmes. We also saw it with Trey Wisner. So when you talk about your stars and the guys that kind of garner that attention, I do think Trey Wisner is one of them. Who will be his running mate on the opposite side? To hear Warren Roberson's name as a guy that they trust, because that is a big position that we saw make a lot of impact a year ago. If that's Warren Roberson, that's a great step in the right direction for what he could be, not just on special teams, but at that cornerback position as well, if he can continue to carry that over to the defensive side of the ball, because, cornerbacks have been a topic of conversation in terms of depth, rotation, and what that room in its entirety looks like. To have those two names mentioned to me, very important. But Bobby, to your point again, to hear Michael Taft as a guy who I saw this spring in a workout, and I asked him point blank, I said, hey, are you going to be a coach one day? When this is all done, you wrap up the cleats and you put up your locker, are you going to go into coaching? He goes, listen, I've been asked that so many times in my life that I think I might just become one. I think many people have pointed that out to me. I haven't given it much thought, but it's been asked so often that maybe I have a future in it. He just has that kind of mentality. So great to hear all of those names mentioned again. But Wisner and Roberson were the two that I kind of honed in on and said, okay, I think they're in the right direction with the Gunners.
I want to say this, Bobby, on Maurice Blackwell. When at Arlington Martin practice prior to his senior year, they also had Ernest Cooper, the edge, that went to Stanford on that team, and a couple others. One we won't mention that just got in trouble, who was a little younger. But Mo Blackwell was covering kickoffs the day I was there, and he did it with a smile and a hustle. And I was like, you can't fake that. You either like it or you don't. And he was a committed to Texas player who still was having fun covering kickoffs. Some things never change.
Gerry, I'm going to stick with you here and ask you about the punter situation. Banks said that it's down to 3, and they're going to roll them out there and see who wins it. What do you know about the 3 punters that have the job up for taking all the takings?
Yeah, so I watched Ian Ratliff in high school because he was on the Atascocita team with Cam Dewberry. So one of those, I watched a couple of games of his. And the first time I ever noticed him was in warm-ups, because I like to get there early and kind of take in that part when the kids walk on the field, and then watch the punters and kickers in warm-ups. And I walked away from that. I actually texted a couple of more lower D1 schools and said, y'all need to take a look at this guy. This guy he's definitely a Division I punter. So Ian Ratliff having some success there, it doesn't really surprise me. He's competing with a kid from, I believe, Cypress Ranch, who's a junior as well there. But look, Texas obviously has a lot of belief in Michael Kern. If they didn't, they would have gone to the portal. So that's a lot to put on a freshman. I don't care what position you're playing. I mean, catching that snap and punting the football in the fourth quarter when you're up 3, there's pressure in those situations for guys. So I think it's Michael Kern. They probably want Michael Kern to go take the job because he's got the biggest leg. I mean, he averaged 46.5 his senior year at St. Thomas Aquinas, ranked one of the top 3 punters in the country. He has the biggest leg. He has the most talent, but he's got to go get it. And since he wasn't in for spring practice, you never know really how those guys are going to react, even though there's not 100,000 people in the stands pressure. But Ian Ratliff can do the job for sure if he's called upon. But I think Michael Kern physically is definitely the most talented guy as far as leg speed, trajectory, and everything that goes into it. I think he's got a bright future. Question is he ready to do as a freshman?
Good stuff. All right. Last thing I want to say about special teams, and then Jeff Banks, we also got to talk to him a little bit on Tuesday about the tight end. So I want to talk about that too. But first on special teams, it sounded like from listening to Banks that Matthew Golden at kick returner and Silas Bolden at punt returner would get long looks. He basically said, look, we've seen them do it in other people's uniforms. We need to see it for ourselves next and compare them to what other players we have. Those other players being Jaden Blue, Isaiah Bond, Jonte Cook, and DeAndre Moore. But he said that's where he's leaning right now, at least, and they probably have a great chance of getting that done for them. Before we go talk about tight ends, because you always get Jeff Banks to talk about tight ends a little bit, I do want to say thank you one more time to our sponsor, Adam Lowy, Lowy Law Firm. If you've been injured in a car wreck, truck wreck, ATV accident, motorcycle, Adam and his firm give a free consultation to those people who think they might be due compensation. All you have to do is reach out, loweylawfirm.com. More than 2 decades of experience. I appreciate Adam and his group sponsoring State of the Program each and every week. Guys, tight end. Jeff Banks was effusive in his praise of Juan Davis. He also said, look, Amari Niblack has done the right things. Said a couple of revealing things about that, you know, he had a small surgery that put him a little bit behind the 8 ball as far as getting into spring ball and really acclimating, but they let him get going and go and take a little bit more each time, but they kept him healthy the whole way. Talked about Gunnar Helm developing more leadership this year, in his opinion, which, you know, he likes his first 3. Here's what really blew me away. He called Jordan Washington a rising star.
Yeah.
Called him a rising star. Said he came in at 215, 218, and what is he at now? 248. And look, 4 to 6 months. Are you kidding me? What did y'all take away from that one, Gerry?
I don't think any of us are surprised on Jordan Washington. I go back and I get
the recruiting rankings would be surprised because
he ended up being a 4-star guy though. He was one of those guys who rose from 3-star to 4-star right his senior year and in the top 300 of the country. So he did rise some, Bobby. Maybe not as high as he should have been, but I always go back and give Todd Thompson his high school coach credit at Langham Creek. Because so many times when you have a guy like that, they just spread them out wide, just run go routes to those guys. Just try to get the ball in their hands and let them score touchdowns. Todd Thompson, not asked, demanded, and put him in situations where, no, you're going to be a blocker here. You're going to play some sniffer position. You're going to play some inline tight end. Yeah, we'll split you out when we want to as well. But he made him a guy that came back from AAU basketball to football. He helped advance his physicality. And I think that's underrated what they did. Kind of like the Richland High coaches, when they moved Daniel Cruz to center his senior year and let him play the position he was going to play long-term in football, Todd Thompson at Langham Creek put him in positions to be a blocker, be a physical football player at the tight end position. Because that doesn't always happen in high school. But his physical gains doesn't surprise me because he has very long arms, seeing him in person a couple of times, but basketball keeps a lot of weight off of you. So when you give up that the high school and AAU season and you get into Texas in January and you start in that strength and conditioning program, now you have a summer on top of it with the frame he had, 6'4.5", with an 81-inch wingspan. And his lower body was ahead of his upper body because he's a basketball player. So putting on that much weight, not really a surprise. I think the thing, Bobby, that one of the big takeaways from the spring game is he's fearless. That's an important component of that position.
Got to be willing to play through contact in football.
Yeah.
If not, you're not a football player. You're just an athlete. And that's a great way to put it, Gerry. And I think people could envision it when you said it. I think that the one that I took a little bit, I was a little taken back by, he called him a rising star. Yeah. He didn't just say he's a guy, right? We're going to, you know, there is a little more reverence there than just, oh, this guy's going to be pretty good down the line.
Right.
And so that's going to happen. All right. Now we're about an hour and a half away from the first football practice of the season. We're going to be out there covering it. We will be back with a special episode right after practice ends, or actually right as the viewing period ends for a live stream here. Do not miss it today on Texas Football. For CJ Vogel and Gerry Hamilton, I'm Bobby Burton. This has been State of the Program. Thanks again to our friend Adam Lowy over at the Lowy Law Firm. Hook 'em.